Have you ever woken up at 3 in the morning, stared at the ceiling, and felt a strange emptiness creeping into your chest? It's not a specific pain, but a vague sense of instability, as if you're on a boat without an anchor in the middle of a violent ocean. The world outside seems to be spinning in endless chaos. The news, social media, family expectations, financial burdens, and the white noise of modern life. It surrounds you, making you feel small and directionless. Many of us try to cope with that chaos by seeking grand solutions, massive turning points, or simply waiting for a magical burst of motivation to lift us out of the mud. But the truth is usually much colder and quieter than that. Years in the military environment showed me a completely different perspective on human existence and resilience. There, I learned one thing. When the world around you collapses, the only thing that keeps you from dissolving isn't iron will or extraordinary courage. It's the smallest things. It's the mundane habits you usually overlook. In boot camp, I learned a fundamental truth. Standards do not wait for feelings. When the whistle blows at dawn, no one asks how you feel, if you slept well, or if you're ready for the day. You stand up, you make your bed, you tighten your laces. That isn't oppression. It's a system designed to replace the fragility of human emotion. Look at our modern lives. We live in an era of self-indulgence. If we feel tired, we sleep in. If we feel bored, we scroll for hours. If we feel stressed, we seek instant gratification to fill the void. We act based on our feelings, as if they are a supreme commander. But feelings are the most treacherous things on earth. They change with the weather, with the amount of caffeine in your blood, and with random external triggers. When you let emotion lead, you are building your life on sand. Meanwhile, in a disciplined environment, every small action has its place. Smoothing the blanket on your bed isn't about pleasing a superior, it's about affirming to yourself, even if the world outside is mad, in this tiny space, I am in control. I am capable of creating order from chaos. Maybe you've told yourself these small things don't matter. Why make the bed when I'm just going to get back into it tonight? Or why prep my clothes when I can just pick them in the morning? Those are the whispers of self-betrayal. Every time you break a small promise to yourself, a tiny crack appears in the foundation of your self-respect. Over time, those cracks spread. When the real storm hits, your mental structure collapses. The difference between the man who stands and the man who falls is often whether he maintained the smallest standards when no one was watching. In the military, no one saves you from the standard, and that is exactly what makes a man grow. Standards aren't meant to create superhuman strength to lift the world. They are meant to maintain stability so the world doesn't crush you. Imagine a soldier in a high-stress situation. If he has to stop and think about what to do or weigh his feelings in that moment, he's dead. Instead, he acts on habits repeated thousands of times in peace. External order supports internal clarity. When your hands know exactly what to do, your mind has the space to remain calm. You might be avoiding looking at this, but look back at your past week. How many times did you promise to start over on Monday, only to let procrastination win? How many times did you choose immediate comfort over long-term discipline? We often excuse ourselves by saying we're waiting for inspiration, or that we're too busy with big things. But the truth is, if you cannot manage your bed, you will never manage your career or your life. Discipline is not punishment. It is the highest form of self-love. It is telling your future self, I respect you enough to build you a solid foundation right now. The chaos of this world usually starts with the chaos of daily routine. Waking up late leads to a rushed mood. A rushed mood leads to poor decisions, and poor decisions lead to a bad day. When this repeats for 10, 20 years, the result is a life full of regret and untapped potential. Compare two scenarios 20 years down the line. One man lives by emotion, always seeking convenience, evading self-imposed rules. He might be fine materially, but deep down he's always anxious, insecure, and easily toppled by minor setbacks. Conversely, the man of structure, though unpretentious, adheres to small disciplines every day. After 20 years, that man possesses a composure that money cannot buy. That composure comes from knowing he can trust himself. He has proven to himself 10,000 times that he will do what he said, regardless of the circumstances. In the military, we understand that motivation is a luxury. Motivation is like a passing breeze. It might help you go a bit faster, but it won't take you far. What takes you far is the system. When everything is chaotic, the smallest thing is often what holds the structure together. It might be waking up on time, keeping your desk clean, or exercising for just 10 minutes. These actions seem meaningless against global issues like inflation or conflict, but in reality, they are mental anchors. They send a powerful signal to your subconscious that you are still the captain of your ship. When I look at society today, I see a slow erosion of character. People quit easier. They compromise with lower standards easier. We blame the circumstances, the lack of resources, or other people. But rarely do we look in the mirror and admit that our lack of discipline in the small things has weakened us. This self-deception is comfortable. It doesn't hurt immediately. It just takes away a little bit of your self-respect every day, until you wake up and realize you are nothing but an empty shell. You might be wondering if it's too late to start. The answer is it's never too late to establish a new order. But it doesn't start with a grand plan. It starts with you standing up right now and doing that one thing you've been putting off. Don't wait for Monday. Don't wait until you feel energized. Do it because it is the standard you set for yourself. In the military, we don't have the concept of getting it over with. We have the concept of doing it right. The difference between these two is massive. Getting it over with is for the outside world. Doing it right is for your own conscience. An undisciplined man after 20 years often faces declining health from accumulated bad habits, financial instability from impulsive choices, and, most importantly, fractured relationships. When you cannot discipline yourself, you cannot be a pillar for anyone else. On the other hand, the man of structure, after 20 years, might not be the richest or most famous, but he has the absolute respect of his family and community. He is a rock in the middle of a rushing river. His strength doesn't come from aggression, but from the steady stability of someone who has won 10,000 small battles every day against himself. I've seen people with extraordinary talent fail miserably because they had no structure to keep that talent from scattering. And I've seen average people achieve extraordinary things through persistence in the smallest disciplines. Repeated behavior is more reliable than a burst of resolve. A man who gyms for 10 minutes a day for 10 years will have far better results than the man who trains for 3 hours but only lasts a month. That is the power of accumulation. That is the magic of order. Modern life encourages us to look for shortcuts or easy fixes, but in the world of truth, there are no shortcuts for character. Character is forged through the times you chose to do the right thing instead of the easy thing. Every time you choose a bitter truth over a sweet lie, every time you choose to finish a task instead of seeking entertainment, you are building a mental suit of armor. That armor won't stop life's bullets from being fired at you, but it will stop them from piercing your heart. When you feel everything around you is so chaotic you can't breathe, narrow your vision. Don't try to solve all the world's problems or even all your life's problems at once. Focus on what is within reach. Control what you can control. An unstable environment requires a stable system to replace wavering emotions. Create that system for yourself. Maybe it's just going to bed on time, keeping a promise to a friend, or completing a task with total focus. I don't say this to criticize anyone. I say it because I have seen the difference discipline makes, not just in the military, but in the quietest corners of daily life. I have seen people destroyed by too much freedom. Freedom without boundaries leads to getting lost. And I have seen the quiet joy of those who live within the framework they set for themselves. Discipline doesn't make life easier, it makes the man stronger. It doesn't remove pain, but it gives that pain a purpose. Do you ever wonder why we feel comfortable around highly disciplined people? It's because they offer predictability. You know they will show up on time. You know they will keep their word. That reliability is the result of a persistent training process. In a world where betrayal and uncertainty seem to be the new standard, a person of principle becomes more precious than ever. Your stability can be a silent source of inspiration for those around you, though you may never know it. We often mistake discipline for a loss of freedom. But in reality, the greatest slave is the one shackled by his own immediate desires and emotions. A man who cannot say no to his own laziness is never truly free. True freedom is the ability to do what you know is right, even when every nerve in your body wants to do the opposite. That is self-mastery. And self-mastery can only be gained through the practice of small, daily disciplines. Look at how you treat your time. Time is the only asset we cannot recreate. When you waste it on useless things, you aren't just losing those hours, you are throwing away a piece of your potential. The military teaches us that time is life. In civilian life, time might not take your life immediately, but it will take away your meaning slowly. The erosion of character is a silent process. It doesn't happen in a big explosion. It happens through 10,000 small, wrong decisions. I want you to take a minute to be truly honest with yourself. Where are you in your journey? Are you the driver, or are you just a passenger drifting with the current? If you feel lost, don't panic. Start by re-establishing the smallest order. Don't make big promises to the world. Make a promise to yourself and keep it. That is the only way to regain lost confidence. That is the only way to stand firm when everything around you collapses. In the military, there were times we had to march in total darkness, where you could only see the heels of the person in front of you. You didn't know how long the road was. You didn't know what was waiting ahead. You just put one foot in front of the other, over and over. Life is like that sometimes. You don't need to see the whole picture to move. You just need to take the next step correctly. The accumulation of those correct steps will eventually lead you out of the dark. Standards are not something to brag about to others. They are a private conversation between you and the person you want to become. If you still believe that standards mean something, perhaps you find yourself belonging in conversations like this. Not because I have the answers to all your problems, but because we share a belief that human dignity lies not in what they possess, but in what they persistently guard during the hardest times. As this video ends, you'll probably go back to your busy life. You'll face the pressures, the temptations, and the daily chaos again. But I hope that in some moments you will remember the bed made neatly, the laces tied tight, or a small promise you kept to yourself. Those are the first bricks of a mental fortress that no force can break. External order will bring internal clarity. When you know who you are through your actions, the outside world becomes much less frightening. Remember, in chaos, discipline isn't a burden, it is your life jacket. It is what distinguishes the man swept away by the current from the man who carves his own path. Thank you for listening to these reflections. I don't say these things to judge. I say them because I have seen the difference discipline makes. It doesn't make life easier, but it certainly makes you steadier against any storm. Would you like me to dive deeper into how to build a personal discipline system based on military principles that you can apply to your daily work?